Welcome everybody to the Virtual Doors Open Day 2020 at the National Library of Scotland. Today's session, not in the normal circumstances on Doors Open Day, we'd be happy to welcome you to the library and we would give you tours of the library building in person. But unfortunately, because of the situation that's ongoing in the world, regrettably, that's not going to be possible this year. However, ourselves and other participating organisations who are taking part in Doors Open Day are trying to provide as much as possible available in a virtual format. So before we start today's section, make a couple of acknowledgements. First of all, can I thank Matthew Fellion from the library's MAP library for moderating today's session. Matt was very generous to help out at very short notice. Most of the material that's used in this particular presentation has been kindly supplied by the National Library of Scotland, SCRAN and Historic Environment Scotland. Particular thanks must go to the National Library's Imaging Service and to Mr Neil Fraser of Historic Environment Scotland for the help and support in preparing and sourcing the material that we're going to be using in this particular presentation. Now we're going to call this presentation Books, Biscuits and Blackslur. And it's a visual history of the National Library building at George Forth Bridge in Edinburgh. Because we're going to concentrate on the National Library building at George Forth Bridge, we'll briefly talk about the library's other locations. But if you're more interested in finding out information about the library's facility up at Causeway Side, my colleague Lara Quinney has produced an excellent video which we've uploaded onto the library's Doors Open Day page. So I'd recommend having a look at that if you want to find out about Causeway Side. But here we are, here's the National Library of Scotland building. Now, despite what some people may think, the National Library is less than 100 years old, and its home here at George Forth Bridge is even younger than that. So hopefully what we'll do today is we'll tell you the story of the founding of the library, the creation of the building, and at the end of it, you'll understand why this building once looked like this. But our story begins in 17th century Edinburgh, to when the precursor of the National Library building was first established. In the 1680s, the Faculty of Advocates, the independent body of lawyers permitted to practice as advocates within the law courts of Scotland, first mooted the idea of establishing a library of the best and finest lawyers and rare books. In March 1689, the then Lord Advocate, Sir George Mackenzie of Rose Hall, formally inaugurated the Library of the Faculty of Advocates. Mackenzie was nicknamed Bloody Mackenzie for his treatment and prosecution of the Covenanters. Like many of his time, Mackenzie was a complicated character, and despite his reputation, he was opposed to obtaining confession by torture and defended several women who had been accused of witchcraft following forced confessions. He is buried in Greyfriars Kirkyard, and his apparently haunted mausoleum is sited near to where so many of the Covenant prisoners were once held in the southern part of the kirkyard. Originally housed in Parliament Close, a fire in 1700 destroyed part of the close, and so new accommodation for the Advocates' Library was sought. In 1701, they acquired the use of the Lake Hall next to Parliament House for their library. In the early 19th century, Parliament House was extended to offer better accommodation for the courts and other public bodies. In 1815, the Baroque Signet Library opened, and in 1822, the Advocates' Library moved into its upper floors. However, the faculty soon felt they needed their own building, and in 1826, they sold their stake in the Signet Library to the Society of Writers to the Signet for £12,000. This sale helped fund the Advocates' Library, which was opened in 1833 as part of the western extension to Parliament House designed by Sir William Playfair, and it's still home to the Advocates' Library to this day. Now, under the 1710 Copyright Act, the Advocates' Library was granted the right to claim a copy of every book passing through Stationers' Hall. The 1842 Copyright Act reduced the number of libraries with this right to 5, and the Advocates' Library was the only one in Scotland which had this right of legal deposit. Thus, The Advocates' Library became the largest reference library in Scotland, and with the Advocates purchasing further books and manuscripts, it became a national library in all but name. Members of the public could still access the collections in the Advocates' Library, but if you wanted to have repeated access, you had to have a covering letter from a member of the faculty. The financial upkeep of such a huge collection began to prove too much for the faculty, and so several attempts were made to secure financial support from government and the public purse. Discussions between the faculty and a sympathetic government were brought to a halt by the outbreak of war in 1914. The First World War exacerbated the situation, as with so many advocates either serving at the front or working in wartime positions, subscriptions to the upkeep of their library significantly declined. Following the war, a committee headed by the future Lord Advocate, Hugh Macmillan, was established to resurrect discussions, and in 1922, the faculty offered the transfer of their library to the nation. Unfortunately, the country was still recovering from the ravages of the war, so funding for the venture was limited, with the government only pledging an annual grant of £2,000 towards the library's upkeep. With further support required, a National Library Endowment Trust was established as a means through which public donations could help the proposed National Library. The Trust published a pamphlet, which was co-authored by Macmillan's friend and the famous author, John Buchan, setting out the aims of the library, with a statement countersigned by several eminent Scotsmen. A supportive Scottish press published an appeal for the funds in early June 1923. However, any fears that the Endowment Trust would not raise the necessary funds were soon eased. On the 28th of June 1923, the Prime Minister, Stanley Baldwin, told the House of Commons that the financial difficulty had been removed by the generosity of Sir Alexander Grant. Sir Alexander Grant had risen from humble roots in Forres to become the owner and principal shareholder of McVitie and Price, the famous Edinburgh biscuit manufacturers. Now, you may have never heard of Sir Alexander Grant, but you'll have certainly tasted his most famous biscuit, the Digestive. Grant was a driven man, but he was very self-effacing. He was known for his acts of philanthropy, and he made benefactions totalling some £750,000 during his lifetime. But the biggest donations were his donations towards the National Library. His donation of £100,000, in the region of £3 million in today's money, was soon followed by other generous donations of money and material, including the donations of many rare collections of books and manuscripts, as well as financial support. In his memoirs, Hugh Macmillan recalled how Sir Alexander Grant got the money to him. I was told one day in the Parliament House that a gentleman desired to see me. It was the manager of one of the Scottish banks. He said, "I've come to pay over Mr. Grant's money," and thereupon handed me a cheque bearing Mr. Grant's signature. I at once noticed it was blank as to the amount and asked the meaning of this. "My instructions," came the answer, "are to leave you to fill in the sum." "This is most embarrassing," I replied. "I understand that the amount was to be £100,000. "Mr. Grant did mention that sum to me," said the banker, "but his instructions were quite definite that I was to leave the figure to you." "Well," I said, "I couldn't think of writing more than £100,000, and so I filled in the 6 figures and made the cheque payable to the endowment trustees." I then asked if I should give a receipt, but this amazing interview concluded with the assurance that no receipt was required, and I put the cheque into my pocketbook. The object of the endowment trust had been achieved within the short space of 3 months, and it only remained for it to hold Mr. Grant's £100,000, Lord Rosebery's £5,000, and 1 or 2 smaller gifts until the reconstitution of the library was effected. William Kirk Dixon, then keeper of the Advocates' Library, remembers how Hugh Macmillan came into my room and laid on the table Mr. Grant's cheque for £100,000. We just sat there and looked at it. Once the final conditions of the transfer were settled, on the 7th of August 1925, the National Library of Scotland Act received royal assent. On the 26th of October 1925, William Kirk Dixon was confirmed as the first National Librarian of Scotland, and the Advocates' collections of over 750,000 items were formally presented to the nation. A few days later, the Reverend Donald Ross was the first recipient of a reader's ticket to the National Library of Scotland, but because of the lack of proper stationery, it had to be reissued a few days later. Initially, the National Library's collections had to be viewed in a single reading room next to the Advocates' Library, and as you can see from these pictures here, it filled up very quickly. It was clear that the National Library needed its own dedicated facility, and so further funding was sought. Again, the generosity of Sir Alexander Grant formed the basis of a building fund. In 1928, he gifted a further £100,000, but on the proviso that the government matched his donation pound for pound, that they would commit to the project, that he would be the only private donor, and that the building should preferably be built at Jordforth Bridge. In terms of Scottish architecture, any National Library building would be one of the most important national institutions to be built in the coming decade. However, choosing the site caused great debate, referred to in the local press as the Battle of the Sites. Well, the first Battle of the Sites. Originally, the Ministry of Works proposed building a major administrative complex on the site of the old prison on the southern slopes of Calton Hill. This would include a new National Library, a new courthouse, and a new headquarters for the Scottish Office. However, the proposed designs proved deeply unpopular. Things got heated following the leak of a sketch to the local press, which showed an impression of the proposed design. The Cockburn Association described it as a desecration and a permanent disfigurement to the capital of Scotland. Another critic claimed that the building looked like a cross between the Lamasery at Lhasa and a Kirkcaldy linoleum factory. The Ministry of Work sent a delegation to public meetings in Edinburgh to try to calm the ire. At one feisty meeting, the Commissioner of Works was told by one irked local that "I would sooner see the Calton jail site covered over with nettles that I should see a design from an English office, even if it had been done by Michelangelo himself." With the Royal Incorporation of Architects in Scotland writing a letter of opposition to Scottish peers and members of Parliament, the government abandoned the wider Calton scheme in October 1930, and only the Scottish Office headquarters of St Andrew's House, designed by Thomas Tate Architects, would be built there. The library announced that it was pressing ahead with plans to build a new National Library building at Jordforth Bridge, but this only led to the Battle of the Sites, or rather, the second Battle of the Sites. Several local architects, including Messrs Mears and Caris Wilson, proposed that the library be built at the police chambers to the east of Parliament Square, and the Edinburgh Architectural Association pressed the case further through the local newspapers. The library's trustees defended the site at Jordforth Bridge on both technical and economic grounds. It was in a central location and so was accessible for readers in relation to other key libraries in the city. It would be built largely below street level and therefore offered the space for essential additional storage, while its proximity to the existing Advocates' Library would allow the continued use of existing storage. In financial terms, the library would acquire the site at no cost, while construction and the related costs could then be staged. A formal inquiry was called, and it wasn't until July 1931 that a parliamentary commission formally declared the site of the National Library of Scotland. Now, the chosen site had long played a role in Edinburgh's history. For hundreds of years, it had been previously a narrow street called Liberton's Wynd. The Wynd was famous for a couple of reasons. First, at the north end of it, was where executions took place in Edinburgh. This engraving of William Burke's execution shows an archway to the right of the scaffold. That marked the northern entrance to the Wynd. Liberton's Wynd was also known as the home of one of the city's finest taverns, known as the resort of all revelling wits of the Toon. Owned by John Dowie, Dowie's Tavern was famed for its drink, and was even celebrated in verse. O Dowie's ale, thou art the thing, that gars us crack, that gars us sing. Dowie's most popular drink was the ale supplied by Archibald Younger, a potent fluid of which few could dispatch more than a bottle at one sitting. Given where it was located, Dowie's was a popular meeting place for the chief wits and men of letters. As such, it was frequented by writers, artists, the judiciary, and was even the most popular drinking place for Robert Burns during his sojourn to Edinburgh. Now, Liberton's Wynd was demolished before the advent of photography, and so surviving images of it lie in artistic impressions. These engravings by the deaf artist Walter Geekie show how steep and narrow the Wynd was. The Wynd and surrounding streets were demolished due to the 1827 Edinburgh Improvement Act, which demanded that a communication be made from the Lawn Market to the country to the south by a new bridge and street over the Cowgate. Named after the late Regent, who was famously visited Edinburgh in 1822, George IV Bridge was opened in 1835, and over the years, tall buildings were built up on either side of this elevated street. The precise site for the new library building would be the Edinburgh Sheriff Courthouse. Built in the 1860s by the Edinburgh architect David Bryce, most famous for his Fettes College and the Royal Infirmary complex nearby, as such, it had been hoped that Bryce's original facade would be retained in any new building. In 1934, the Ministry of Works confirmed it would appoint Reginald Fairley as architect of the National Library. Taught by the famous Scottish architect Sir Robert Lorimer, Fairley was famous for his designs of churches, country houses and memorials. But he had also worked on projects including schools and other public buildings. His brief was to design a building with dignity and symmetry. But with so many cultural ambitions for the library, it took 3 years before Fairley finalised the design, which met approval from all interested parties. The facade of the courthouse could not be successfully incorporated, so, like many public projects of the 1930s, a neoclassical style was chosen for its grandeur and its impressive scale. Fairley described his design as Greco-Gothic. It would be composed of a large central block flanked symmetrically by 2 lower ones. A largely windowless facade would be decorated by sculptured panels. This particular elevation is interesting because it shows you how far down the Cowgate Valley the building had to be and how much piling was required for the building's foundations. The Fine Art Commission praised the design as being scholarly and dignified. Fairley himself claimed that he wanted it to have an air of frigid serenity, which he felt would suit the ultimate purpose of the building. And so, with Fairley's plans accepted, demolition work began in 1937, and the Edinburgh Sheriff Courthouse was slowly demolished block by block. Over the next 2 years, the courthouse was slowly razed, mostly by hand, by an army of workers on site. These snaps were shot by library staff at the time, and they give you an idea of the scale of the task that was faced by the demolition crews. By the late 1938, the courthouse had been demolished completely, and so with the site clear, piling could begin. However, despite the fact that piling had begun and the steel structure had begun too, by 1939, it was clear the library project could not proceed further. In November 1939, the Ministry of Works mothballed all public projects not vital to the war effort. So by the end of 1939, all that was standing on the site was the building's steel skeleton. Most of the library's work ceased for the duration of the war, and it was run on a skeleton staff. Here in this picture, you can see the then librarian, Mr. Meikle, and one of the curators, Mr. Beattie, who were seen on duty whilst acting as fire wardens on the building site. Having spoken to a man who grew up in Edinburgh during the war at nearby Riddle's Court, he recalls that during the war, children who lived in the Old Town would often try to sneak into the building site and effectively use the steel structure as a giant climbing frame. And so there was always wardens on duty trying to steer them away. Now, given the destruction that had been wrought on the likes of Guernica, Shanghai, Warsaw and Rotterdam by aerial bombardment, there was genuine fear that Edinburgh could be destroyed by attack from the Luftwaffe. And so much of the library's collections were spirited into secret country locations for safekeeping. In 1945, delegations from the library travelled to these locations to recover the hidden collections. Here you can see a team from the library's manuscripts department who are photographed at Glenormiston House in the Borders on one such errand. During the war, there had been real concern that the library would never be completed. Irate councillors had written to the council demanding to know why their constituents' railings had been cut down for the war effort, but the sea of steel at the library site still stood. Other post-war reconstruction projects took priority, but finally in 1950, permission was given to proceed on the principal work on site once more. The principal contractors, Colin McAndrews and partners, brought cranes onto site in order to help move the steel beams and concrete panels up and down the elevated building site. While steel and concrete formed the structure, the exterior was clad in this, Blackster. It's a medium-grain honey sandstone that's quarried in Otterburn in Northumberland. And since the 1890s, it's been used in many prestigious buildings, both in Newcastle and Edinburgh on the exteriors. One of the more famous examples in Edinburgh is the Jenner's department store on Princes Street. Their exterior is clad in Blackster too. With work progressing, the project was dealt a blow, with Reginald Fairlie's untimely death in 1952. In Fairlie's place stepped one of Fairlie's partners in his architectural practice, Alexander Ritchie Conlon. Conlon had joined Fairlie's practice following service with the Royal Engineers bomb disposal during World War II. Liaising with the Ministry of Works site architect Stuart Sim, Conlon oversaw the completion of the library. During the final stages, certain elements of Fairlie's plan were simplified, partly due to time, partly due to cost. One example is the ornate doorpiece. Here on the left-hand side, you can see a picture of the proposed model, how it was supposed to look. And there on the right-hand side, you can see a picture of the completed doorpiece. And as you can see, it's not ornate as it was in the original plans. But overall, the building is true to Fairlie's original vision. With the library structure secure, the decoration Fairlie had envisaged for the facade was added, with much of the carving done in situ. Hugh Lorimer was the head sculptor. Son of the architect Sir Robert Lorimer, he had been a close friend and sometime collaborator with Reginald Fairlie. Though Fairlie's designs were often simple, he would try to enhance them by using craftsmen to provide decorative details. Recommending his friend to oversee this work, following Fairlie's death, the Ministry of Works formally appointed Hugh Lorimer and allowed him to assemble a team of skilled craftsmen and sculptors. These included Scott Sutherland, Scott Barr, Maxwell Allen, and Elizabeth Dempster. You can see Elizabeth Dempster here on the right-hand side, working on the Royal Scots Monument in Princes Street Gardens. Most striking features of all on the facade are the allegorical statues, carved in situ by Lorimer while standing up a ladder, and the decorative rondels above them by Elizabeth Dempster. Each one represents a different discipline, and from south to north they are music, theology, law, the creative muse. This is the central figure of the statues. History, science, and medicine. While these appeared in the central block, on the two wings of the buildings are 6 panels by Scott Barr. They represent various methods of communication in which ideas are transmitted into the minds of man and children. Internally, there was a minor change to Fairley's original design. Helen Munro Turner of Edinburgh's College of Art was commissioned to engrave the large window overlooking the main staircase. Born in Calcutta before returning to Edinburgh as a child, Helen Munro was a skilled engraver and keen book illustrator. Her passion for glass engraving and design had taken her to Germany, where she studied for many years in 1939 until she had to return to Edinburgh owing to the war. On her return to Edinburgh, she established a studio of glass design, and she also helped establish the Department of Glass Design at Edinburgh College of Art in 1941. Turner's decorative panels acknowledge the faculty of advocates, Sir George Mackenzie and Sir Alexander Grant. Work on site completed in late 1955. The library building was 9 stories high, 2 stories above George Forth Bridge, and the remaining 7 below the bridge, leading all the way down to the Cowgate. There were 30.5 miles of shelving holding some 20,000 tonnes of books and printed material. In total, it cost £600,000 to complete. The electrical fittings had been specially constructed by Fox Stadelman and Company, and the electric services were installed by James Scott and Company. This involved laying 40 miles of electric cable, 3 miles of electric conduit, and over 1,000 feet of cable trunking. The decorative interior woodwork was installed by Scott Morton Limited's Albert Works of Muirston Road, Edinburgh, using a range of timber supplied by Alexander Harvey Limited of Queen Street. This included French walnut in the reading rooms and Burmese teak in the entrance hall. The decorative wrought iron balustrade in the main staircase was erected by Thomas Haddon of Roseburn. The staircase, along with the floor and the base of the columns in the entrance hall, were cased in green Westmoreland slate with borders of black or grey marble. MacAndrew and Partners were so proud of their work on the library, this dramatic picture of the construction graced the front cover of the firm's commemorative history in 1955. The other key firms and companies who contributed towards the library's completion were recorded in the official programme of the library's opening. The library was formally opened by the Queen and Prince Philip on the 4th of July 1956 at a ceremony held in the library's reading room. Rather than a bouquet of flowers, the library thought a bibliographic gift was more appropriate. And so they presented the Queen with a facsimile copy of the Chetmill and Miller prints, the first books printed in Scotland in 1508. As well as the books, a ceremonial key was presented to the Queen by Mr. Orchard of MacAndrew Partners to formally open the library doors. The key was made of gold, weighed 2.5 ounces and was 4.5 inches long. The bowl was shaped like a little book, which could be opened by a small Bible clasp. Inside was inscribed, "The National Library of Scotland, opened by Her Majesty the Queen, 4th of July 1956. The bowl was joined to the key shank by a hand with Elizabethan ruffs on the sleeve. The library was quite concerned about this gift, however, because apparently a couple of years previously at a similar event, the Queen had been presented with a key to open the doors. But unfortunately, that venue, they had actually kept the doors locked with the expectation that the Queen would actually physically unlock the doors. As she apparently struggled to do this, the library was wanting to avoid any possibility of embarrassment to themselves or the monarch. So they were very keen to make sure that the doors themselves would remain unlocked. However, once the Queen put the key into the escutcheon, someone standing behind the doors would open them as if by magic. The opening ceremony was attended by dignitaries and librarians from throughout the UK and beyond. Librarians from Europe and America were in attendance, but perhaps the person who had travelled furthest was a gentleman from the National Library of Peking. As well as the message of congratulations, Mr. Ting gifted to the library copies of the first translations of Stevenson into Chinese. Over the coming days, the library took the visiting librarians around Edinburgh, gave them a feast at Edinburgh Castle the following night, and then a couple of days later, they were taken to see the Fife Mobile Library Service. It seems that Mr. Ting went missing for a little while until he was discovered sitting in the back of one of the Fife Mobile Libraries, which he seems to have mistaken for his bus back to Edinburgh. So it seems that for a good couple of hours, he was having a wee tour of the East Neuk as opposed to travelling back to Edinburgh. So what did the interior look like and how did it work? Well, this is an image of the original map reading room. If any of you have used the library recently, this is now where our main cloakroom area is. At the time of opening, it was equipped with microphone machines, had enlarged tables for maps and charts, and enlarged storage cases. It even had a soundproof room with desks and a pulley system, so readers could use their own typewriters without disturbing anyone when in the library. The room's skylight cupola had a decorative outline of a globe suspended under it, casting the shadow of the world onto the floor below. Most of the surviving images we have from the opening are in black and white, but these colour swatches show what the room's original finishes would have looked like, and do show that there would have been an element of colour into the interior finishes of the library buildings. Also on the ground floor, there would have been an exhibition hall. This is still used as the exhibition hall nowadays, but for conservation, we usually have the windows blacked over. The library was visited by Robin Cockburn of the Scottish Home Service, and he broadcast there prior to its opening to the public. He walked through the library and described it as, "The feeling is one of commodious simplicity, of beauty without embellishment. In this building, which will not only house the largest library in Scotland and one of the largest in Great Britain, but will be one of the greatest centres of reading in the whole world." So you would pass through the hall, you'd be drawn towards the main staircase by the light of the window, and then you would carry on upstairs to these doors here. And these are still the doors in use today. And as you can see, this was another feature of Fairley's design, these ornate door handles. But once you pass through these doors, you're into the issue hall. Once in the issue hall, you would be consulting one of these large chests. Now, whereas nowadays we've computerized our catalogue, back in the day, if you want to look for a book, you had to look through these card indexes. These were effectively the library's catalogue. Once you found the particular reference to the book that you're after, you would complete a form and you would pass it to staff at the issue desk. They in turn would send it down one of those hoists that you can see at the back of the room there to the library's book fetching unit, and they would go and find the books on the various stacked floors below. Books were then consulted in the general reading room. This is a picture of the reading room when it first opened in 1956. The east wall had large windows through which light would stream. On the west wall of the reading room was a balcony halfway up, which held books and could be accessed from a small spiral staircase at the southern end of the reading room. The library soon proved popular and became a victim of its own success. With readers sometimes having to queue before seats became available, the reading room clearly needed to expand into how it appears today. So in 1973, work on a mezzanine level began. It was completed the following year, and in 1974, the mezzanine level formally opened. This offered us more storage and more seating capacity. When the building was designed in the 1930s, the figures given to the architects were based on the expectation that the library wouldn't reach capacity until the end of the century. However, by the 1960s, space was already at a premium. In the 1980s, the rear of the building was expanded over the backyard at the Cowgate. This wraparound extension, which you can see here in the image on the right, now houses the library's conservation studio. This is where our collection care staff tend to maintain the library's fragile collections for future use. Storage was still an issue, so for many years the library still had to use vaulted cells in the neighbouring Parliament House. However, not for the first time, biscuits came to the library's rescue. For years, Middlemiss Biscuits had operated from a factory complex at Salisbury Place, over at the Causeway side. However, by the 1970s, Middlemiss had ceased production, so the site was open to lease. Proposals to take over the former Heriot Watt building in Chamber Street fell through, so the library first leased and then bought the Middlemiss factory outright. However, the factory building was showing its age and was prone to leaks, and so the library approached the architect Andrew Merrilees to design a new building for the library's use. Constructed in 2 stages, the Causeway side building was completed in 1995. With 19,000 square metres of floor space, it now houses our map collections, millions of books, and some of our specialist units, such as our digitisation projects. There are 7 levels at Causeway side, 2 of which are in fact below ground. The library also took over the former HMSO bindery at Sighthill. This is now a workshop for our collection care department, who use the facility to produce boxes, supports and other conservation aids. Back at George Forth Bridge, we've also extended upwards, and we now have 15 floors in George Forth Bridge. This room that you can see here is built what was on once the library's roof. This is the special collection reading room, and it's where the library's collections of rare books and manuscripts are consulted. It also offers the best backdrop in the library. The large picture windows offer great panorama views over the rooftops of the Old Town towards New College and Arthur's Seat. And you can also see over the rooftops towards the old Parliament House and the spire of St Giles Cathedral. Here in the aerial shot, it gives you some sort of context about exactly where that is. That grey, this grey construct that you see here, that's the special collection reading room there. So that's level 15 of the library. When the library first opened, that would have been a flat roof space, and the large glazed windows that you saw in the picture earlier would have been against that wall there. So that's what's up at the top of the building. But what lies down beneath in the lower levels? Well, to get there, you have to take a lot of stairs as you drop down through the building until you eventually reach the stacked floors. Now, this is where the library's collections are held. When the library first opened in 1956, it contained nearly 2 million items, but our collections have grown exponentially since then, and it's now possible to access nearly 30 million items within the library, and that's in either electronic material or else printed material. In terms of some unusual items within the collections, our oldest printed item is a Japanese 8th century Buddhist prayer scroll. The oldest book that we have is a copy of the Gutenberg Bible from 1455. The oldest Scottish books we hold are the Chapman and Miller prints, which were published in the Cowgate in 1508. The smallest book that we have is effectively the size of a human fingernail. It measures 1 millimetre by 1 millimetre, and it's an 1885 edition of Old King Cole by Bryce Publishers of Paisley, who specialised in making small miniature books. By contrast, the largest book that we have is an atlas called Bhutan, a visual odyssey across the last Himalayan kingdom. And it's huge. It's so big that we actually had to physically design a special trolley to be able to move it around. because it measures 5 foot by 7 foot and weighs 60 kilograms. In 1956, the library received 74,385 new items. But in recent years, we've received as many as 320,000 new items per year. That's almost 6,000 items per week. As the National Library of Scotland, we have a special remit to collect and preserve anything of particularly Scottish interest. But we also have a responsibility to promote ideas and cultures from throughout the world. And as such, there are over 490 different languages represented within the library's collections. We have specialist collections of rare books, manuscripts. A manuscript collection can be a single item, such as a letter or diary, or an entire library of material. For example, we recently acquired the archives of the authors Muriel Spark and Ian Rankin. In terms of maps, there's over 2.5 million maps and other cartographic items which can be seen over at the Map Library at Causeway Side. We have music collections, and with the establishment of the Moving Image Archive, our collections of film footage and sound recordings can now be accessed either online or through at Glasgow's Kelvin Hall, where we now have a dedicated facility. The importance of the collections has been recognised by UNESCO, who have added several items to the Register of World Memory. These include Errol Haig's War Diary from the First World War and the library's early Gaelic manuscripts from the 14th to the 17th centuries. Other rare and unique items include, I've got a few examples here, we've got the Last Letter of Mary Queen of Scots, the Order for the Glencoe Massacre, a first edition of Demonology by King James VI, a first edition of the Kilmarnock Burns. Now, it was the success of this compiled edition of his poems, which was the springboard of success for Robert Burns and ended his plans to emigrate to the West Indies. We have the original manuscript of Darwin's Origin of the Species. We also have archives of numerous writers, scientists, philosophers, playwrights. We also have like a lot of theatre companies. So for example, we have the archive of the 784 Theatre Company, who is famous for their play, The Cheviot Stag and the Black Oil. And we also have numerous medieval illuminated manuscripts, such as the Iona Psalter, which was produced in the late 12th century for the Augustinian Priory on the island of Iona. Now, the stack floors have no windows, and so you need a torch or ceiling lights to guide your way around. When you leave a stack floor, you have to put all the lights out. So the stacks can be an atmospheric place to be. We don't think they're haunted, but who knows what you might find lurking in the shadows downstairs. Should you evade the library's pet xenomorph, you'll make it back to the library's entrance level and live to use the collections another day. So that brings us an end to the short presentation. I hope you enjoyed it. I'll leave you with one question. Is this a biscuit or is it a bit of Blackster?